So welcome to part 2 of looking at our senses. In part 1, we looked at what science and some basic understanding from our science tells us about our sensory input. We had a look to see how we generate a sense of taste and smell, temperature, hearing, and seeing, and we explored seeing quite a bit more in detail using optical illusions. So please go and have a peek at part 1 if you want to have a sense of what we can learn about the working of the outer stimuli, the translation of those into nerve impulses by the senses, the experiential sensation that arises as those nerve impulses hit the appropriate part of the brain, and then some of the other mental working that is required to make sense of what it is that we experience through our senses. So part 2 is trying to pull all these ideas together and add to them some of the ideas that come to us from religion, to try and create as harmonious or well-strung together a continuum of our understanding of the senses as is possible, and obviously one that fits into the understanding of holism. So what we saw in part 1 is all those wonderful outer stimuli that we can study through science, the waves and vibrations and energy and particles and so on, and how they arrive into the senses, this portal of the senses I'm calling it, and generate these nerve impulses to the brain. And there, when they reach the right parts, these sensations arise of sound and light and so on. And if you happen to doubt that these are subjective, and this whole kind of realm of subjectivity, I'm calling it the world accessible to arts and religion, forgive me for that naming process. Maybe in time you will recognize quite why I've done that. It's too much to get into now. But if you doubt that sound and these other things are subjective experiences, then imagine that you could hear sounds and suddenly you were in an environment of people who couldn't hear sound. They were all completely deaf. They could feel the vibrations, they could measure the vibrations and so on using scientific methods, and perhaps even have sensory receptors for those kinds of vibrations, but they didn't get a sensation of sound. You'd have a pretty hard time proving to them that you can. And I'm not even sure how you would go about doing that. But there is definitely something subjective in that experience. And what's really nice to watch, if you're interested, is videos of people who can hear for the first time, or colorblind people who see for the first time. They're quite moving when people come suddenly to an awareness of that sensation. What a powerful impact it has on their experience of reality. So these are two worlds, but according to Goethe, there's actually one world. It's a monist oneness. There's an intimacy between the two. And we know that anyway, because that's how we experience reality. So something extra is what Goethe actually called like a holy prize. Something is happening that these inner sensations that we have, we don't imagine them happening in our head. And if you do actually imagine that it's just all happening in your head, all these sounds, if they suddenly were just seeming to you like they're happening inside of you, that would be really disturbing. And apparently there are some folk with autism where they suspect that that is what's going on, and part of what makes it so hard for them to connect to the outer world. So there is this absolute intimacy, and so there's a suggestion that we project these inner sensations back out like we did with our processing of our sense of sight and making sense. So in the same way, with processing of all our senses, we project them out onto where they come from, onto the food we're tasting, onto the light that's shining for us, and so on. And Goethe and Steiner refer to this, and Aristotle and Smuts himself, they all call themselves monists. They all recognize the oneness, the intimacy between all these different aspects. But Goethe clearly states the intimacy between the inner and the outer. So I wrote a poem several years ago to try and capture what this is, and forgive me, but I'm going to read my poetry to you. A dark and silent world, do our senses lie when they fill space with sound and light? Vibrations and waves reach ear and eye from air and sky. Chemical change and sparking paths lead the signals to our center, where we perceive and are moved in measure. Then out We chase the signs to place them back where they began and touch the stimulating world around. What kind of being are we who experience a rich, full life in science's silent, mechanical night? So it's just trying to catch some of the magic of that. And as a science teacher, I write poetry and I will share it with my students to try and bring them some easy to remember, easy to learn way of capturing the essences of what it is that I'm trying to teach them. And if you happen to teach this topic, please feel free to use the poem. Now, religions guide us further. They kind of take everything we've said and they add to it. I've got quotes here from the New Testament, the Quran, and the Bhagavad Gita. Bhagavad Gita is from the Hindu sacred texts, if you aren't aware of that. So let's read them in order. Therefore, speak I to them in parables and stories, because they seeing see not, and hearing they hear not, neither do they understand. So Matthew's not questioning the physical processes and all the other mental processes of making sense of what our sense impressions are. He's referring to kind of a mental accompanying and working with that accompaniment to make sense of it rationally, consciously. And therefore they don't get to understand. So it's kind of taking everything we've looked at before and adding something of a presence accompanying that. Let's see what the Quran has to say. So when the Quran is recited, then listen to it and pay attention that you may receive mercy. That's really interesting. So it's not just an understanding. Something's going to happen from that understanding that's going to come into an experience, an embodied experience, feeling filled of mercy having been received on some level, some kind of a comfort. It's a very interesting way that biblical texts or religious texts take the idea of what we receive from the senses. But this is my favorite, the Bhagavad Gita. When a man dwells on the pleasure of the sense, attraction for them arises in him. From attraction arises desire, the lust of possession, and this leads to passion, to anger. From passion comes confusion of mind, then loss of remembrance, the forgetting of duty. From this loss comes the ruin of reason, and the ruin of reason leads man to destruction. So very powerful, clearly laid out set of steps that we should really work hard to try and avoid. Now, all of that is a matter of being aware of what's going on inside of us. So it's not just consciousness, to use the Smuts kind of evolutionary substance. It's our personality, it's our growing self that has to take conscious possession of whatever it is that we're experiencing, which might otherwise naturally lead us into what he's talking about: desire, lust, passion, anger, and confusion of mind. And saying, actually, there's another part of us, this part that religions seem to, through all three of these quotes, moving us towards, is actually using our personality, our growing self, as I call it, using this to really shape the way that we interact with our sense impressions. And so I hope you can feel kind of a continuity from the way we started in part one to where we've arrived at now. And to conclude this whole exploration of our sensory experiences, we can look at them as Smuts has laid out in his holistic evolutionary sequence, starting with the energy and the matter. And these energy and matter stimuli from the outside come in towards us, and then our life processes take hold of them and move them and shape them as is appropriate. And I've got the consciousness as it rises into sensation. So everything below the experience of sensation, conscious sensation, I'm putting down in life. Now, obviously, you can argue with me on that and argue about what is matter and what is energy. But there is nonetheless, I hope you can sense, a shift, a movement from the more perfected, highly evolved energy and matter, moving into the life processes. We know sometimes they don't work, color blindness or deafness, and rising them into consciousness. And then what do we do with those experiences, and how do we process those with our personality, so that and I'll just read what I've got there. The training of these habitual responses with self-discipline and with understanding, forming hopefully some kind of an inner balance of feeling, of reason, of understanding, and then this gorgeous kind of global is how I understand this word mercy, that it becomes a fully embodied experience. So we can, if you have followed the journey from part 1, you can see a real movement within the senses, right from the simplest or the earliest or the most perfected evolutionary-wise substances of energy and matter, moving through the scale to this youngest, most ephemeral, most imperfect, kind of almost wrestling in the dark, trying to make sense of the world, human personality that we are in the modern day, but how religions seem to have an insight as to how we could proceed in as healthy a way. And then just to remind us of what I shared in the origin story, that ultimately, when as a personality we can truly embody in a healthy way all this realm of experience, hopefully then the next level of evolution will take place. And you'll remember I hypothesized that to be something that religions tell us, something of a spiritual nature, of a blessedness, hopefully that will arise. Let's wait and see. Thanks so much for sharing this time with me, and I hope to see you again with one of the further videos. Have fun. Bye.